digamos, aproximarnos otra vez a este tema de la paz, pero esta vez desde la perspectiva, pues, de la Iglesia Católica, ¿no? La Iglesia Católica ha promovido desde, pues, siempre la paz, pero tiene esfuerzos dedicados, constantes, frecuentemente poco visibles a nivel de diplomacia, pero también a nivel de posicionamiento. Y una de las cosas interesantes es que la Iglesia Católica, en cuanto al conflicto en Ucrania, que hemos visto ya hoy en la mañana, también ha tomado posición, también ha tomado iniciativas. Y por lo tanto, pues la hemos invitado a impartir esta conferencia. No pudo estar con nosotros, lo va a hacer online también. Y me permito leer la semblanza de la profesora Simona Beretta. Simona Beretta es profesora titular de Política Económica en la Facultad de Ciencias Políticas y Sociales de la Universidad Católica del Sacro Cuore. Imparte disciplinas de Economía Internacional y es directora de uno de los máster de la Escuela de la ASERI, una escuela de graduados y posgraduados. Se recibió en 1978 en la Facultad de Economía y Comercio de la Universidad Católica del Sacro Cuore. Hizo un máster en Economía en la Escuela de Economía y Ciencias Políticas en Londres en 1981. Simona es extraño, pertenece todavía, o es extraño para Europa, no tiene doctorado, pero bueno, ha pasado pues toda su vida en la Universidad Católica del Sacro Cuore. Tiene muchísimas publicaciones, en gran parte en economía, pero también en otra parte en el ámbito pues, del pensamiento social cristiano. Es miembro de varios consejos pontificales y últimamente pues, es la nueva directora del Centro Universitario para la Doctrina Social de la Iglesia de la Universidad Católica del Sacro Cuore. También es redactora en jefe del Diccionario de la Doctrina Social de la Iglesia y es miembro de, ya lo dije, de varios comités pontificales. Muchas gracias y cedo la palabra a la doctora Simona Beretta.
Good evening. I'm Simona Beretta from Università Cattolica del Sacro Cuore, Milano, and I thank very much for the invitation to speak at this conference. And I wish, by giving my presentation, to participate in the very important process of promoting the common good. We have so much in common. And what we have in common is the very first basis for speaking about the common good. We have in common our humanity, our aspiration to things that are good, just, beautiful. And I'm talking about communion and peace in the present world, which is a world of war. Coming from Europe, we feel war as we haven't felt, as people of my age hasn't felt for ever felt as we do now. So I will speak about communion and peace amid war. This is war. This picture was taken by the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine in March. It looks like a piece of art, but indeed it's just an aerial picture of an abandoned tank. You can see the Z that characterized the invasion troops. It's a tank, but it's a skull. It speaks about the violence and the death that surrounds war much more than many other pictures that describe distractions and disaster. This is a war in a continent where war was unexpected, in a sense, although we should have been expecting it, it's a war that makes itself visible. But we had wars within Europe that, even if they might have been even closer to countries of the European Union, have been perceived as more localized, more peripheral. This case is a conflict which is clearly a world war fought in pieces, as Pope Francis said many times, but still this piece is big enough to provide a challenge for the whole world. It's a war in a continent where we had experiences of peace. The process, starting with the creation of the Community for Coal and Steel in 1951, to the process of creation of new countries after 1989, and still we have a war now, and it's all wars don't make sense, but this war doesn't make sense in particular because it's a war between two countries that share so much. Their common baptism, the language is not that different. The popular songs and the lore are absolutely interchangeable. Many families are mixed families. So it's a war between brothers. In this war, the voice of the Pope has stood out clearly, saying no to war. This book is just a summary of what Pope Francis has been saying about the Ukrainian crisis, but about war and the need for denuclearization, the need for stopping the trade in weapons, the need for peace in this Third World War fought piecemeal. So it's a collection of writing, and I simply invite you to read it if you want. There's nothing new in a sense, but reading it all together make us thinking. This book has been accepted as if it's almost obvious that the Pope should say no to war, and it was quickly dismissed as unrealistic or utopian. As a matter of fact, we should challenge this statement, and I would like to underline this expression that war is against sacred things, is a sacrilege. Life is sacred. Why is it so, let's say, cheap to dismiss it as unrealistic or utopian? Well, because the mysterium iniquitatis, the mystery of evil, the mystery of sin, is very present in our lives. And the roots of war go deep into human hearts. The message of this book is that there is no such thing as a just war, which doesn't mean being equidistant from the two parties that are directly fighting, Ukraine and Russia. The Pope has been very explicit in saying that there has been an invasion, an aggression, and that there is an invaded country which is the first victim of this war. But any realistic attempt to find a path of peace has to discuss in depth what can be thought as peace, because building a culture of peace requires the definition of peace. And I think the quickest way to answer the question, what's peace, is peace is a process. It's not the end game. It's not the conclusion of a power game between the powerful. It's not the end of fighting because one part is so strong with respect to the other that the victim and the weaker part is losing. This is not the kind of peace we are thinking. And this is also the imagine of peace that comes out from the reflection of the international community. Say the 2005 UN report on peace building and peacekeeping, the Brahimi report, is very explicit about what peace is. And I read, peace is about changing mind, a culture of peace. Education is key. It's the key action, this is the quote, undertaken on the far side of conflict to reassemble the foundation of peace and provide the tools for building on those foundations something that is more than just the absence of war. So this perspective that the Pope is offering is also taking stock of what the international community has learned about the process of peace building and peacekeeping, which have not been a clear, successful path. It has been a path of very strong difficulties and of struggle. As I said, there is no just war and no equidistance. And what we should recall is that what you say in presenting the conference, that paz is the fruit of a dynamic of bien común. Paz, fruto de una dinámica de bien común. I think this is very important. And we have to remember that we say bien común, we say both the good of nations and the good of people, each and every person. So we need to keep the rights of nations and human rights both at the same time as important. So before saying that this perspective, this Catholic perspective, is unrealistic or utopian, we should check whether it's true or not that, as the Pope quotes in the introduction, wars find their roots in the fading of faces. We have this macro phenomenon of war because we miss the micro dimension of looking at the face of the other. And we can also check the realism of the perspective of the Catholic Church by a very quick overview of what popes have been saying. The no to war is not recent. It's a long story starting at least in 1848, when Pope Pius IX refused to provide soldiers for fighting a war for defending the territory of the state of the church. And then we can move on, and as an economist, I would like to recall the 1917, it was a radio message by Benedict XV, the famous discourse in which he speaks of useless massacre. This is how in 1917 the Pope was describing the First World War. And he was not just declaring this, he was also suggesting peace-building practices, including the necessity for not overburden those who would lose the war. This suggestion was obviously unattended, was not taken seriously, but this was exactly what made the difference between the end of World War I and the end of World War II. And this is what more or less John Maynard Keynes was, let's say, lobbying for between the two wars, the necessity to think about paying for the war in ways that would not impose undue sacrifices to all countries that had suffered from the war itself. And then there's another line of reasoning for discussing whether this is unrealistic or utopian, and is the following. Check against facts. Which war you are aware of accomplished anything? Let's think of the wars of the 21st century. We had Afghan coming from previous times, a totally unresolved situation, and Iraq, and Libya, and Syria, just to mention a few of the big conflicts that in some sense have involved the international community in a more direct sense. And then you can also check against facts whether other forms of fighting wars, say sanctions, are realistic and provide solutions. Well, sanctions against a country with authoritarian government tend to reinforce the support for the authority, so have the opposite political effect. And the economic effect is obviously lower whenever countries can access resources that can compensate energy, oil, gas. So the point is, this no to war is much less unrealistic than it is immediately thought. And even just wars, all the wars I mentioned were justified somehow. Humanitarian intervention or this preemptive wars and so on. However, the Pope has been building on a tradition of peace culture that, well, for example, Cardinal Parolini recently quoted this passage by Don Lorenzo Milani, a priest of the peripheries, an intellectual, an artist that was segregated in a very small and poor village in Tuscany because he was sort of creative. We're very creative, by the way. So Don Milani wrote, World War I had 5% civilian and 95% military deaths. It could still be argued that civilians died incidentally. In the second, 48% civilian and 52% military. It could no longer be argued that civilians had died incidentally. In the Korean War, 84% civilian and 16% military. It could now be argued that the military died incidentally. And we are now facing a war in which, not just in Ukraine, think about Syria, this war is fought exactly against civilian, exactly for making life impossible for civilian. So can we now say that we have something that looks like just war? And with the possible use of weapons of mass destruction, can we still think that it's reasonable to think that wars can be just? So let's build on the positive side. How can we face war? And I'm not going to quote too many things, but I would like to share with you this point 261 of Fratelli Tutti. It says that all wars leave the world worse than it was before. I think this is a statement we can underwrite. It's a failure of politics and humanity. And so we need to touch the wounded flesh of the victims to understand war and to build a culture of peace. The wounded flesh of victims makes us able to grasp the abyss of evil at the heart of war. And at that point, it will not trouble us to be deemed naive for choosing peace. So we need to proclaim and uphold the rights of nations and human rights that are both rooted in human dignity, because we know that part of expressing human life in full, we need to live in communities. And so the respect of human rights is also the respect of communities so that they can live and have a successful future. The foundational right of living in the civic, social, and political life of a nation is at the same time part of human dignity, personal human dignity, and part of the rights of nations. This dichotomy that in practice means individual human rights should be taken care by taking care of individuals. And this can be done by the state or by international institutions or by NGOs. And okay. And then we have the geopolitics of nations, and that's another story. So the right of a nation to exist depends on whether the power game allows this and thinks this is useful for the status quo or the changes in the status quo that are desired. Overcoming this separation between the micro and the macro, between the human dignity of each and every person and the rights of nations, is a key passage that allows us to think about war and peace in the perspective of a culture of peace. So let us ask the victims. If we go for expressions that are particularly significant in Fratelli Tutti, we run through this idea that in societies we have the role of both architects and artisans. And this is an interesting perspective because it allows us to say whether architects are listening to artisans or not, and those who touch the wounded flesh of the victim are exactly artisans, and they should be the first to be heard in any discussion about future peace. So let's start analyzing who are the victim. Well, too many. In Ukraine, we had deaths among soldiers and civilians. A huge number of deaths, including children. Mass graves. Internally displaced persons and refugees. Refugees and asylum seekers. But we also have victims in Russia. The death among soldiers, in many cases young and unexperienced soldiers. We have the detention of opponents of the war or of any element that is perceived to be a foreign agent, including, as we will see, memorial. And then we have victims out of global interdependence. The conflict has provided shocks in food prices, in food availability, in energy crisis, and we can go on. And I would like to add, we have victims in families, especially in those families that are mixed, Ukraine-Russian, or simply live on one side or the other side of a boundary that has become a hot boundary, and that is also under the threat of inability to communicate, with sons that tell fathers, the Russians are bombing us, and the fathers say, oh, no, 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 that's just propaganda. That's just Ukraine propaganda. And it's this non-communication is something that can really break hearts. And this is victim as well. These are the numbers of refugees. We are talking about millions of people. And some of them had been able to access national protection schemes, and but most of the refugees, especially here, I'm thinking especially about Italy, where we have not a huge number, but a significant number of Ukrainian refugees. They tend to go and join with the members of their families, and there this thick network of family and friendship relationship that can work as an artisan for artisanal form of support, of helping one of the most severely wounded in spiritual and relational terms uh, victims of this war. But just to show you something that struck me a few days ago, this graph from The Economist, which shows who among the Russian male have been drafted for serving in the army. And horizontally you have the level of monthly income, so poor and rich, and the national average is here. And the percentage of people that were drafted, 0 to 4, 6%, shows how intensively regions have been touched upon the drafting. And you can see that most drafting comes from the poor regions, where opposition tends to be lower because the poor have less voice than the rich. Now, what can we do in this situation? Well, there's a role for all players, and the possibility of moving on is I like this picture because it speaks of the capability of talking to each other, whatever is happening. I think this speaking to each other is part of what we can understand as important in building a culture of peace. Building a culture of peace is based on dialogue and recognizing what makes us part of the same humanity, what we have in common, what sort of community experience can we have. And pacification starts with strongly affirming that we can mutually recognize each other as humans. The victory is not peace. Mutual recognition is the beginning of peace, of the peace process. And so I think we have to recall a few items that are necessary for a peace culture to develop. One is overcoming ideology, overcoming the ideological perspective that has been so common in the recent past, but it's still with us. The names of the ideologies may have changed, and they tend to take connotations that depend on who's speaking the word, say what it means to be Nazist. But this ideology justifies the elimination of anything that doesn't fit into the interpretation that comes from ideology itself. Second, we need to promote and develop a language of peace. We know that this war has been fought with arms, but also with words. And the verbal escalation has started before the military escalation, and then the military escalation has prompted another round of violent linguistic use of terms that could only lead to making the fight even more fierce. We have to break the spiral. We have to break the spiral and move ahead, learning to speak a language of peace. And then we have to promote a more balanced historical narrative. I was struck by learning from Ukrainian women coming to Italy as helpers, home helpers, that they had no idea of the famine that was experienced by Ukraine in the 30s, in the early 30s, as a way to clamp down the opposition of the population with respect to the existing form of government. historical narrative has been under uh, close scrutiny by the Putin administration, and school reforms have been taken. Yeah, but we need to keep the conversation going on, let's say, evidence-based historical narrative, because this can help diffuse hate speech. And there's no way of doing this with repressive tools. You can't keep hate speech under control just by repression. You need to build a positive culture of peace. And for this, we need to revisit the role of memory and revisiting all the experiences of pacification we can think of. We can look at the fact that pacification is possible, and we need to learn what artisans and architects can do to contribute to this pacification process. And if we do all the above, which cannot be done by repressive tools, cannot be done top-down, it has to be done bottom-up, we see that the big element of change, the big driver of change, is the power of the powerless. Because a pacification process walks on the fine path, the knife edge of trusting the possibility that there's something good in your partner, there's something human in your partner, that yes, you have very different visions, that yes, you have very different interests, but vision and interest can be communicated. And you have to leave the possibility that the other can have something to say to you, and you can have something to say to the other. We need recognition. Is it unrealistic or utopian? Well, I'm not sure. If we look at what has been happening, is that we have a lot of expressions that show us that humanity is resilient, is still there. For example, on March 1st, more than 270 Russian Orthodox priests implored forgiveness and peace. And their message is very touching, because their message, I'm going to get it. There we are. Their message, I lost it. Well, is asking, in a liturgical period in which they just celebrated as Orthodox Church the Sunday of the final judgment. They are recalling that final judgment is awaiting everybody, and they ask for forgiveness and peace. And they also say that this is not to be taken as being against the authority, because this is just being faithful to the message of the gospel. So they were well aware that this could be taken as a political statement, but they make this effort to explain that they are not speaking out of political visions. They are speaking about a truly deep, profound religious vision. And we also have, in a more recent time, this statement, public statement, of the Conference of Catholic bishops in Russia. The Catholic community is relatively small, but it's very spread all across Russia. And they are talking, this is a message issued in October, the 6th of October, and it's about the drafting. And it's about the importance that all Catholics, in this case the message is to Catholics, that all Catholics have a serious conscience dilemma, because they, in a sense, could think that it is their duty to do what the authority tells, and at the same time they have to consider that it's true to obey the authority if what the authority is asking is the best way of putting an end to the conflict. And again, there's a passage of the letter which says, we appeal to the fact that the possibility of objection, conscientious objection, is part of the legislation. So we ask the authority to remember that they agreed to introduce this principle in their legislation. So again, you see, it's not a breaking statement. It's a statement in which the messages are addressed both to the religious community and to the civil authorities as a possibility of dialogue. And we know that dialogue can produce fruits. Yes, of course, and going back to the image of the video conference between Kirill and Pope Francis, we see that that didn't accomplish anything, and that Kirill is steady supporting the decision of going for the war. But still, the two high authorities of two big churches could agree on a statement on Ukraine in Cuba when they met in 2016. So there's something that can keep the conversation going on. And this conversation can go on because powerful people or people in significant position express themselves, but also because we have this artisan way of dialogue. Because the possibility of recognition is something that is related to the fact that we have something in common, and we have something in common across religions. I'm just putting the, let's say, the image of the very recent event that was held in Rome, sponsored by the Catholic Church and organized by Sant'Egidio, community of Sant'Egidio. And Pope Francis last Sunday said that, I invite you to join spiritually in this great invocation to God, the cry for peace, because prayer is the strength of peace. So this is something that allows conversation among all the religions, and this interreligious dialogue is very important all over the world, but it's significantly important in Russia, for example, where, let's say, just an example, the local imam was the one promoting the publication of the Russian translation of Fratelli Tutti. So we have a place for, let's say, high-level dialogue, maybe we can say this, but we need the artisan dialogue that comes from person to person, heart, to quote Cardinal Newman. Because this is the truly Catholic perspective, Catholic slow case, the common experience of humanity. If we think about building peace and we use the keywords of the messages of World Day of Peace that has been published since 1968 by the Catholic Church, by the popes, well, these keywords are truly universal words that make sense in all human hearts, because they resonate in human hearts as their most deeply felt aspirations. So they can penetrate the incandescent nucleus of human experience at all latitudes, at all time. Words like life, truth, memory, justice, mercy, forgiveness, because this is what being Catholic is about, sharing the common experience of humanity, being aware of the great gift we received of Christ's incarnation, because Christ revealed man to man, as Vatican II said, because what Christ wants is unity. He prays ut unum sint, not just the members of one church or the other church, of all churches. All humanity is called to be one. So I would like to say something about the hopes for peace and the reasonable hopes for peace, even in these days that are so frantic and that are so worrying. So I will use these words: life, truth, memory. And I will start with life. And I will say that life is stronger than death, both because this makes sense to elemental experience of everyone, but by recalling a beautiful writing, a beautiful essay by Wassily Grossman that was titled The Sistine Madonna, but is more commonly referred to as the Madonna in Treblinka. You see, the Sistine Madonna is this Raphael painting in which you have this adolescent mother and this toddler with an expression in the eyes of Jesus' eyes that speaks about awareness of all the ugly things that are in the world. And yet these eyes, Madonna's eyes and Jesus' eyes, speak of their stubbornness, their resilience. They will be there, whatever. This essay was written in 1955. It was published in Russia only in 1989, but it circulated outside Russia within the network of the Samizdat, which is something that helped keeping connected Eastern Europe and Western Europe in years in which these connections were looked with much suspicion on the side of the Soviet power mostly, but it was something that probably ran deeper than that. Life is stronger. We can hope that life wins, because this is just a reasonable hope. And then we have truth. Well, truth is a word that has been almost prohibited in Western Europe, because truth is too engaging and truth is divisive and that sort of things. But this is the expression that we learned from non-believers like Václav Havel. Václav Havel, a prominent writer and movie director and intellectual, was against the Czech regime, and so after the Helsinki process, there was this Carta 77, this in 1977, this document signed by a number of Czech intellectuals that ended up in prison, including Václav Havel. So it's written in October 78, and it's a statement in which you can breathe the spirit of time, but it's a timeless message. And as Václav Havel was a playwright, he had this ability, even in essays as this is, to use stories. And he uses this story explaining what it means to live within the truth, not possessing the truth, living within the truth, living in the horizon of truth, embedded in truth. And he has the story of the greengrocer. And the greengrocer that, according to Václav Havel, made an everlasting change in social and political situation in the country. what did the greengrocer do? Well, he simply decided at some point not to put the sticker saying, "Workers of all the world unite," on the window of the grocery shop. Yeah, it's as simple as that. Why do you put such a sticker? Well, because that's a way to show that you are belonging to the world of lie in which you are forced to stay unless you have the freedom of spirit to say, I will not do it. I will possibly pay consequences. I will probably be kept away, dismissed. And the greengrocer is a powerless person. Yet, the power of the powerless is what changes the world. This book was written in 78, and of course it was not published, but the Samizdat edition was published in Milano, was translated by Centro Studio Europa Orientale, which is one of those spaces of dialogue that was active since 1966. And it was created by a priest who went all over Eastern Europe, trying to keep in touch with intellectuals and priests and all those who were trying to live within the truth. Although this expression comes directly from Václav Havel, this was the whole idea. This is him, Father Francesco Ricci, and this is Father Joseph Zvezina. He wrote, he was in prison at that time, and in 1989 he was freed, but he wrote this from prison, this letter to Christians of the Western world, which was a seminal reading for my youth, because it was showing to me what it meant to be Christian. Nothing different from what St. Paul used to say in the good old times. Do not mold yourself according to the thinking of the world. You have a new wisdom, and that's something that leaves a trace. And Centro Studio Europa Orientale produced this journal, Documentazione, so documents, but it also published books. I have some of those, and they're nice because they are by people like Karol Wojtyła, Václav Havel, Joseph Tischner, Siniavsky, and so many others. And Grossman, Vasily Grossman as well. So, yeah, that's something that say that building bridges of peace is possible everywhere. And this is Father Romano Scalfi. He was traveling to Russia. He was at Russicum as a young priest, and he decided that his mission would be to build bridges with the Orthodox Church. And he's in the centennial from his birth, and he created this Russia Cristiana, let's say, community, which also produces a journal. And the journal you saw, the title before, La Nuova Europa, is something that he created. And La Nuova Europa collects both the tradition of Russia Cristiana and XEO, Centro Studio Europa Orientale. I'm saying these things because Italy has played this role, and we can still play this role of keeping open a dialogue, because I am totally, completely convinced that, as John Paul II has been saying many times, Europe can only breathe with two lungs. So this war is making it impossible for Europe to breathe, because we are brothers. We are beyond all seeming evidence. And I think this is very, very important. So this is about truth. Truth is about speaking and listening to each other, knowing that lies won't last. The truth is where generation and generative attitudes can be started. And then we come to the word memory. And here it's obvious, the reference to memorial. Memorial received the Nobel Prize of Peace after being closed, but in December 2021, but after quite a few years of being mobbed and being distressed by the authorities. And I would like to give this link to an event that took place in August 2021, so memorial was still legal. And at this meeting in Rimini, which is an encounter that lasts more or less 1 week, there was an exhibition on memorial titled Uomini nonostante tutto, human beings no matter what. And Memorial has been collecting all documents concerning the life of the millions people that suffered in a period in which their suffering could not be even publicly recalled. It was started by Sakharov, a Nobel Prize, when a mass grave of 11,000 people, mostly killed with a gun shooting in the head, so you could still see the skulls with the hole. In 1989, so when Perestroika and Glasnost were producing their fruits. And Memorial started like that, as a human desire to recall those who suffered. And so they had mass readings of the names of the victims, which took so much time because so many people, and so they collected those little things, and there's a story. So if you click, you can see the story. There's this interview with this lady who was a survived daughter of parents that were that disappeared in gulags, and the interviewer, a young lady interviewing this old lady, was asking, okay, this is what happened to your life, they devastated your life. Which is the most important word, mercy or justice? And the answer of the lady was mercy. And the interviewer would ask, and what about forgiveness? And the lady would say, no, I'm not ready for forgiveness, but I hope there will be a time in which we don't have to choose between mercy or justice. Because the place where this mysterious possibility of keeping mercy and justice together, well, it's in the womb of God, of course, but we human are image of God, and a pale image, we can have a pale experience of forgiveness, which is exactly what this happened. And forgiveness can happen. And I would like to share this story, which is not Ukrainian. This is Vietnam. This is the 1972 Vietnam War, and this is a very famous picture with this little 9-year-old girl escaping from the village in flame, with her dresses burnt by napalm, and her name is Chang Bang. So this lady here is that little girl, and she had a personal story of depression due to the fact that after having been victimized by the fact that her village was bombed with napalm, she was also used by the regime as an image. So she had to go in schools, in places, to give her witness of how she suffered, and she could never put an end to that suffering till she finally could manage to go out of Vietnam, and she went to Cuba, and she married with a Cuban guy. Here he is. They visited the Pope, and she became a Christian, and she had a slow 50 years, right? 72, 22, 50 years that led us to forgiveness and to meet even the pilot of the helicopter who bombed the, the village, who, by the way, also was in a very heavy depression. So there's something that can, in a sense, reconcile. It is possible. Not saying it is easy. Not saying it is easy. Not at all. But we have to have this hope that we can fix it, not because we solve a power game or because we are smarter, but simply because we are available to live life within truth and in the hope that mercy and justice can be reconciled, and keeping memory. And here I would like to go very quickly, because maybe I'm becoming a bit too long, about memory, because as I said, in Europe we have memories of periods in which peace, and unlikely peace, became possible. And I would like to recall the EU once again. The EU, which has a lot of complication, because life is complicated, but still was conceived out of hope that peace was possible. And of course we have the founding fathers that tend to be relegated in the past, but either we keep, each generation has to rediscover that spirit, unless we are willing to go for becoming a useless institution, or the EU. But then we have a much more powerful memory, which is 1989. After all, have you ever seen a Pacific transition as the one we witnessed in 1989? How can we explain it? Did we ever think about what happened at that time? Well, this is 1979. This is Pope John Paul II visiting Poland in 79, and it's the message, do not fear. And it's the message that launched that incredible experience of Solidarność. And that experience made it possible to feel that hope was possible everywhere. And so in 1989 we had this. How did we read this picture? How did the powerful person read this picture? As the end of a war game. We call it the end of the Cold War. It wasn't, as we clearly see now. It wasn't the end of the war. It was a space that was built by the power of the powerless. And this, I think, we should remember. Before dismissing the message of the Church as unrealistic or utopian, we should go back and say that this picture of hope, as the previous picture of hope, were born out of immense sufferings. So we have to be there, willing to suffer for peace. Peace is not cheap. Pacification is full of suffering, but suffering for life to explode, for life to be possible. So asking for going back to negotiation as not unrealistic or utopian. It's asking that something that is possible happens again. I have this slide that says Helsinki, not Yalta. Well, we had in 1975 this multilateral event in Helsinki, and that passage was fundamental for all that subsequently happened in the Soviet world. Because Soviet Russia, the Soviet Union, signed this Helsinki Final Act, which among the principles guiding relations between participating states, you had 10, and the 7th and the 8th was exactly about peace, as we described it: respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms, including freedom of thought, conscience, religion, or belief, and equal rights and self-determination of peoples. So it's everything is already here. And as I mentioned before, these principles encoded in the national legislation, because this is a ratified treaty in Helsinki, was the basis for some is that people that were captured to say, yeah, okay, you will put me in prison, I will serve in prison, I have no way to oppose what you decide, but remember that you are going against the law of your own country. And this message could change even those who were sitting on the side of judges. And this is how peace can come about. And let's recall that the Cuba joint statement by Pope Francis and Kirill was addressing, among many other things, also the Ukrainian crisis. So there's a starting place also there. And of course we have this bilateral Minsk agreements in 2014 and 15, which also outline what should be done in order to solve the conflict concerning the area that is now under heavy fire and, let's say, menacing to become even a worse conflict, including using dirty bombs and maybe nuclear bombs, who knows. I think that there's enough to start something that looks impossible. However, this is a quote, apocryphal. It's not written, it's a quote, oral tradition. By John the 23rd, preparing to launch the Second Vatican Council, and everybody in the Vatican was like, wow, that's impossible. And he said, impossible? Then it's definitely worth trying. Okay. Thank you very much. And I hope you can go on with your work, and let's share our work to building peace by promoting the common good. Thank you again. I will stop the recording.
Muchas gracias. Porque... Sí, gracias. Fue un mensaje registrado, sencillamente porque pues por la hora, ya son las 12 de la noche en Italia, y Simona estaba pues dispuesta obviamente a quedarse despierta, pero pues las preguntas iban a ser entre las 12 y la 1 de la mañana, entonces mejor no. La ponencia es un poco larga. La ponencia, me temo, que apela a varios elementos que las generaciones más jóvenes aquí quizás no han vivido, ¿no? Pero quienes han vivido por ellas, obviamente, pues se recuerdan, ¿no? El nombramiento del Papa, obviamente, pues Solidarność, la caída del muro de Berlín, esos eventos los hemos vivido y obviamente un evento como la guerra en Ucrania pues trae a la memoria estos elementos trae a la memoria estos elementos pasados. Yo creo que hay 2 o 3 elementos sobre los cuales quisiera abrir el diálogo, ¿no? De esta larga ponencia. Primero es, ¿para qué peleamos en una guerra? ¿Para la victoria? Es decir, destruir el enemigo y tener la victoria, ¿no? Nike en griego. Para la justicia, es decir, justicia, libertad, pongan aquí un conjunto de valores, o luchan para la paz. Y son tres tipos de conflictos diferentes, ¿no se le parece? Tres tipos de guerras diferentes también. Y el punto es que vencer, es decir, la victoria, no trae paz todavía. La paz ha de ganarse después. Y es la segunda parte que quisiera poner en el centro de esta discusión, ¿no? ¿Cuáles son los... Frecuentemente hablamos de construir la paz, ¿no? De reconstruir la paz una vez ganado la guerra. Y es uno de los elementos, digamos, en los cuales fallamos de manera repetida, y hay pocos ejemplos, digamos, de éxito, de construir la paz. Uno de los grandes ejercicios logrados es la Segunda Guerra Mundial, ¿no? Pero aparte de eso, pues en los conflictos posteriores fuimos bastante malos, ¿no? En construir la paz. Y creo que aquí, cómo construir la paz, surgen los elementos de valor, de esperanza, de querer construir la paz a partir precisamente del sufrimiento de los que no tienen poder. Es clásico, digamos, de la postura de la Iglesia, tiene trasfondos teológicos sumamente profundos, pero es una postura que si es tomada en serio, pues es revolucionaria, ¿no? Significa que los cristianos no se quedan en esta aula, sino pues que tienen una verdadera vocación, un verdadero qué hacer para la paz. Entonces, dos elementos de diálogo, ¿no? Primer elemento, ¿para qué nos peleamos, ¿no? Victoria, justicia, paz. ¿Y cómo construir la paz? ¿Y qué piensan de esta afirmación central? Pues que la paz se construye a partir del sufrimiento de de las víctimas, ¿no? De la guerra. Abro el diálogo, dejo el micrófono a quien quisiera pues tomar primero la palabra. No todos juntos.
Perdón, hizo una afirmación sobre al principio de la conferencia en la que decía el misterio del mal está presente en nuestras vidas. Y para mí siempre ha tenido una connotación de alguna manera positiva cuando se hablaba del misterio y su presencia en nuestras vidas.
Bueno, es una pregunta personal, no sé si quizás tomamos varias preguntas y...
Bueno, en lo que se animan los estudiantes a hablar español otra vez. A mí la presentación, que ha sido muy buena y además muy bien preparada, me ha suscitado una duda, ¿no? Queda clara la posición del Papa Francisco y en general del pensamiento de la Iglesia sobre el rechazo a la guerra casi en cualquier circunstancia, ¿no? Tradicionalmente la Iglesia había diferenciado entre la guerra justa y la guerra injusta y de alguna forma había justificado la guerra justa, pero ahora estamos en una oposición que es frontal, la guerra nunca puede ser justificada, ¿no? Vale, y eso en una situación como la que vivimos actualmente, en la que además la línea entre lo que es guerra y lo que no es guerra está muy difuminada, ¿no? Me llevaría a preguntarme si el uso de la fuerza por parte del Estado para luchar, por ejemplo, contra el narcotráfico está legitimado o no. Porque si está legitimado, yo creo que la cuestión ya no es tanto en la naturaleza diferente de la guerra respecto al uso de la fuerza en otros conflictos, sino al análisis de cada conflicto en sí mismo. Y si en ese supuesto, si en ese caso, estaría legitimado o no el uso de la fuerza, o decimos radicalmente no al uso de la fuerza, ¿no? Y aunque está mal desde el punto de vista académico llevarlo a la reflexión personal, pero yo tengo un hijo que es un soldado, ¿no? Y mi hijo está dispuesto a dar su vida para defender a los inocentes, ¿no? Supuestamente somos un país que no va a agredir a nadie, pero tenemos un ejército que nos defiende en caso de que seamos agredidos, ¿no? Para mí es duro, para mi hijo que tiene esa vocación de dar su vida por defendernos, decirle, estás equivocado, en ningún caso estaría justificado. Y además me parece que sería una posición no solamente irrealista, ¿no? Lo decía en reiteradas ocasiones, me parece que podría ser peligroso, porque estaríamos dando todo el poder a quien ejerza el uso de la violencia en contra de los inocentes, ¿no? Y tenemos una obligación de defender a los inocentes. Por tanto, me ha gustado, ¿no?, la intervención, pero me ha suscitado algunas dudas, ¿no? Y simplemente añadir, lo que sí me ha abierto perspectiva es el papel tan importante que tiene la Iglesia en estos momentos, o que puede tener, para alcanzar la paz. Yo por eso el mensaje más de el no a la guerra, que es un mensaje muy fácil, me parece que lo que tiene que intentar la Iglesia es hacer una contribución que realmente sea eficaz para poner fin a la guerra y ser capaces de construir la paz, ¿no? Y en esa construcción de la paz no solamente pasa por, de alguna manera, yo creo que el papel de la Iglesia puede ser importante en acompañar, ¿no?, en ayudar, en estimular una posible negociación, sino también en conseguir esa reconciliación, conseguir que después de la guerra no haya pueblos malditos, ¿no?, que es una de las consecuencias más nefastas de la guerra, en la que un pueblo queda marcado como culpable, ¿no?, en su conjunto. Estoy pensando en la Alemania nazi, ¿no?, y el pueblo alemán, ¿no? Podemos culpar al régimen, pero culpar a todo un pueblo que en ocasiones además sufre la opresión, la falta de libertades, y por tanto es un pueblo muy manipulable, ¿no? Culparle me parece que es un error, y creo que la Iglesia también puede jugar un papel muy importante en esa fase de paz para lograr realmente esa reconciliación, ¿no?
Muy bien, ven más un diálogo. Quizás voy a intentar pues retomar lo que dijo y luego añadir algunos elementos aquí. Por favor, no vacilen en tomar la palabra, ¿no? Se trata de hacerla circular. Te paso el micrófono después, ¿sí? Ignacio, sí, mysterium iniquitatis, ¿no? Es el misterio del mal, ¿no?, de la iniquidad, literalmente traducido. Pues este misterio no es positivo, pero es un misterio, ¿no? Y el cristianismo afirma que, y no son palabras mías, es San Pablo, son los evangelios, Hechos de los Apóstoles, que a través de la muerte del inocente, surge una fecundidad misteriosa, que es la de la resurrección de Cristo. Esto no explica y sobre todo no justifica el misterio de iniquidad, es decir, del mal, pero significa que quien vive en este misterio fiel al Padre, a la voluntad del Padre, despierta energías que no conocemos, que finalmente no son en parte pues extrañas y que frecuentemente llamamos las energías pues divinas en la teología griega. En Occidente hablamos más bien de las energías de la caridad, del amor, que son capaces de recrear, ¿no?, vida después de la muerte. Pero, y aquí voy con el otro Ignacio, ¿puede esto ser el paradigma para decir no a la defensa del territorio, de la viuda, del orfelino, del inocente, de nuestro país, de nuestras casas contra los narcos, ¿no? Es decir, sería el paradigma pues avanzar con los brazos abiertos, como tenemos aquí en la capilla, no diciéndome pues mátenme, estoy dispuesto a dar mi vida para que la conversión del narco. Y aquí está la disyuntiva. Todo lo que hay de suizo en mí dice, no. Es decir, prefiero tomar el arma y defenderme, ¿no? Y sin embargo la Iglesia siempre dice, defendiéndote quizás proteges al inocente, pero perpetúas el misterio iniquitatis. Y creo que hay ingenuidad a no defenderse, pero creo que también hay ingenuidad en sencillamente defenderse. Pero bueno, dejo aquí, Alejandro, y luego aquí.
Gracias, Matías. Es difícil no ser reiterativo, pero ante las provocaciones que hacías, ¿no? ¿Por qué se pelea en una guerra? Yo creo que ninguna de las personas que entran, ninguno de los que provocan la guerra piensa que está haciendo un mal, piensa que está respondiendo o a una injusticia o a una opresión. Y yo creo que cuando el magisterio de la Iglesia nos dice que la guerra no es legítima en ninguna circunstancia, ahora el Papa Francisco, es porque falla justamente el diálogo para reconocer que hay una opresión o hay una injusticia, porque el otro la está viendo. Entonces, ¿quién desde el otro lado no tiene la capacidad de verla y entra en un proceso de violencia? Yo creo que esa es la gran pregunta. Porque como ya sabemos que ningún proceso de guerra trae paz al final, digamos, tal como lo planteabas, no es legítimo como vehículo de solución de conflicto y sin embargo permanece ahí la injusticia y la opresión que dio origen. Y luego lo otro de lo que decía Nacho y lo que comentas, brincando al terreno teológico, las dos veces que, cuando a Jesucristo se le abofetea, entra en un diálogo de inmediato, cuestionando el porqué de la violencia y no respondiendo, ¿no? Y ya ni qué decir de todo el proceso de la redención, pero nunca se reacciona de la misma manera. Y me lleva a recoger el guante de Ignacio, porque en México estamos viviendo una política que se enuncia con mucho cinismo, creo yo, de abrazos y no balazos, pero en el fondo, desde la teología, no tendríamos por qué responder. Si seguimos a Jesucristo, no tendríamos por qué responder con violencia a la violencia. Pero cuando se tiene el poder del Estado para asegurar la convivencia, se tiene que hacer cumplir la ley. Y si los primeros que no la cumplen son los narcos, el Estado tiene la obligación de hacer cumplir la ley. Si no, no hay organización social, lo que hay es cristianos abrazándose por el mundo.
Muchas gracias a todos los presentes. Me llamó mucho la atención, Ignacio, desde la mañana, tus acertados planteamientos, tus acertados comentarios. Se me quedaron ahí un par de preguntas, ojalá y tenga oportunidad, seguramente la tendré. Ahorita quiero mencionar algo o remarcar algo que mencionaste acerca de tu hijo. Agradezco que lo compartas, es una muestra de confianza en todos nosotros, te lo agradezco.
Mi padre también fue militar, murió hace no mucho, y mi abuelo fue militar. Mi abuelo acompañó, por ejemplo, a Venustiano Carranza y, bueno, pues fue abatido aquí en Tlaxcalancingo, ¿verdad?, cuando lo mataron. Y mi padre, bueno, pues pasó todo este conflicto de la guerra sucia, el conflicto de Chiapas, en fin, situaciones complicadas, Ignacio. Un día le pregunté, Toño, a mi papá, dije, para ti, ¿qué es México? Y él me respondió, mira, Salvador, para mí México es el lugar que he jurado defender hasta la muerte. Así. Y ya. Esas fueron sus palabras. Entonces, lo comparto también, Ignacio, creo que hay una cultura aquí que, bueno, pues es quizás, no sé si universal, pero sí muy coincidente. Luego, la verdad, tus palabras fueron muy interesantes. A mí me parece que hay una pregunta aquí que alguna vez he escuchado, compañeros, compañeras, tiene que ver con esto. ¿Es Dios, es Jehová, es el Dios el que crean un Dios de guerra? Y la respuesta que me dieron, que está probado, está en la Biblia, pues que sí, a reserva de que, bueno, los teólogos desde luego puedan fundamentar y justificar más una respuesta que, bueno, yo no tengo esas herramientas, pero bueno, en la Biblia, Alejandro, pues si la recorremos desde, no sé, desde el Génesis hasta el Apocalipsis, podemos ver relatos bélicos y relatos bélicos sangrientos. Por ejemplo, de Abraham, el de Abraham, o el de David, o algunos otros, la destrucción de Sodoma, en fin, varios aspectos que finalmente pueden llevarnos a una conclusión de la que yo estoy hablando. Finalmente yo creo que existe una guerra pues de nacimiento entre el bien y el mal. No era así, se presentó, quizás no de nacimiento, se presentó, y yo creo que continúa, y estamos esperanzados en un sistema de cosas en donde no se necesite la guerra. Me parece muy acertado tu comentario y lo comparto. Creo que la guerra no es el mejor, creo que tu comentario es en relación a que no es el camino, lo comparto. Creo que la construcción de la paz debe ser en la paz, ese es el mejor momento. Bueno, sin embargo, la historia puede tener algunas contradicciones en ese sentido. Finalmente, para dar paso a mis compañeros, a Ignacio, quiero compartir con todos ustedes pues parte de mi experiencia. Yo tuve la oportunidad, compañeros, compañeras, de estar 6 años trabajando en México, en San Lázaro. Fui secretario técnico de la Comisión de Defensa Nacional y bueno, pues me di cuenta ahí cómo el presupuesto de las Fuerzas Armadas progresivamente fueron creciendo. Nosotros llegamos en el 2006, tomamos a la Secretaría de la Defensa por ahí de un presupuesto de 24,000 millones, nos fuimos en el 2012 y lo dejamos en 80,000 millones de pesos, y lo que más lamento es que el incremento no era destinado precisamente para capítulos de inversión o capítulos que tuvieran que ver con una especie de cultura, y digo una especie porque bueno, debe ser algo concreto, pero bueno, una especie de cultura de paz. Era para cuestiones, compañeros, compañeras, pues desde luego, capítulo 1000, otro tipo de estos rubros, pero no enfocado a la educación, sobre todo, atención, a la educación general. La Sedena, como ustedes saben, tiene un colegio de defensa nacional y a ese lugar solo admiten militares y personal del servicio exterior. Hay excepciones de repente.
Muchas gracias. Mañana pues tendremos más tiempo de palabra para Santiago. Por mala suerte, Ignacio, ya es tiempo. Vamos a cerrar pues esta tarde del Congreso. Sí es tiempo, ¿verdad? Sí. ¿Me parece? Sí. Perfecto. Con estos elementos, ¿no? Quizás la disyuntiva, ¿no?, que hemos visto, ¿no?, como cristianos para la paz, es decir, en contra de todo tipo de guerra, o como cristianos, pues, capaces, ¿no?, martirios. Yo diría que aquí hay la disyuntiva no es tan fuerte, ¿no? Hay una progresividad, hay una dinámica en la paz. Para retomar elementos que Ignacio conoce, los dos Ignacios. Y precisamente, ¿no?, cuando se afirma que doy mi vida como martirio para la paz, me sitúo al final de la historia delante de un elemento escatológico, es decir, frente a la violencia extrema, debo de estar dispuesto hasta esto. Pero frente al tiempo y la amenaza que con la cual se puede lidiar, pues la defensa es justificada, ¿no? Y ambos aspectos fueron desarrollados a través de la teología, pues, de la Iglesia a través del tiempo. Muy bien, muchas gracias. Los invito todos, los que quisieran, a participar a la proyección de la película que tendrá lugar a las 6:30, 6:15, delante de la Francisco de Victoria. Es una sala que tenemos, bajan las escaleras que hay aquí, cruzan del otro frente y pues casi en el subterráneo, pues aquí hay una gran sala que se llama Francisco de Victoria.